Folks, thank you so much for tuning in today. We have got some items to cover. We're going to take you around the world, give you some snapshots of what's behind the scenes, and see how things kind of around the world, there are emerging themes that are consistent and how that gets spread by media and other sources. So we'll start off with some interesting items. They're all interesting, and stay tuned, especially a little later on. We're going to hear how Starbucks have got themselves in big trouble in South Korea. Well, looking at the UK, there's recent reports on their migration reports in and out of Great Britain, out of the UK, and 136,000 net. This is Gen Z and millennials moving out of a net loss of Gen Z and millennials. This is so basically where do you want to place the age? 15 to 30-year-olds, and then millennials up into the 30s and 40s range, moving out. And as they do this, and people are commentating, and they say, well, it's partly because of the high taxation regime. And you see this, the socialists are very stubborn when it comes to high taxation. They don't want to let go of this myth that all they have to do to get more money to run social programs is tax hardworking people more. It's insane policy, completely against what we proved in Alberta when I was Minister of Finance there. We brought in a flat tax, so you didn't tax people more than just because they were working harder or because they got better educated. They paid more taxes because 10% of 200,000 obviously is greater than 10% of 50,000, but taxing people at an increasingly higher rate because they're working harder or becoming more educated is just dumb policy. So they're starting to see it, but the socialists in Great Britain not seeming to get the message there. There's an interesting story on Bloomberg today, and it's Jamie Dimon is a name that you'll hear from time to time. You might be wondering, who's this Jamie Dimon guy? Not Diamond, but Jamie Dimon. He's the head of J.P. Morgan, which of course is one of the world's largest investment houses. And he's very interesting. He's talking about about AI, and we've been dwelling on this a little bit for the last couple days, that people are in North America, because of the culturally Marxist thinking that we have, that we need to not have progress. He's pointing out the fact that, yes, even in his gigantic organization, which has hundreds of thousands of employees, they are moving people out of strict banking, which is just a matter of doing facts and figures, but they are moving more people into learning AI. So there's a job shift that goes on. It's not necessarily a net loss. So interesting there from one of the largest investment and banking houses in the world. We talked before mainstream media was really going into detail on this horrific killing that took place in San Diego at the mosque there. These two, I'm just going to call them deranged teenagers, I don't even like to repeat their names, who killed people in the mosque, and then they killed themselves. Very interesting here, their manifesto that gets released, and that's why these wackos do this. They have a very negative view. Obviously, they don't care if they live or die. Their manifesto that these two guys wrote, 70 pages long, and a Canadian was mentioned in there, Alexandre Bissonnette, back in 2017. You'll recall that he killed people at the Montreal mosque, and they, of course, raised him to be a hero. Now, it's very interesting because they were doing killing in a mosque. They're also, in their writing, severely anti-Semitic. They hate the Jews. They loved Hitler. And they didn't just use the phrase or the term Nazi. People forget when the media talks about Nazis and they compare right-wing parties to Nazis. Nazi stands for those initials, N-A-Z or Z, N-A-Z-I, Nazi. It stands for the National Association of Socialists, International Socialists. Hitler was a socialist who believed in complete autocratic control, didn't want anything democratic, put him in the realm of fascist, but his economics were socialist, and he believed, even as Karl Marx believed, that the government should decide which of a few large businesses should basically run anything. So these young killers, reflecting even on this Canadian, but mainly because the person had killed Muslims. Again, we hear an outcry from around the world, as we quite well should. It is quite right. Media all people decrying the killing of these Muslims in the mosque. I wish we would hear a fraction of that when we hear about killings in synagogues or in churches. You do not hear the same outcry. Very disturbing. Just reflect on that for a little while. Well, very interesting discussions coming out. The world is bemoaning, as we knew, the Colbert's show, Stephen Colbert, the so-called comedian, his show, we were all given notice that the show was going to be canceled, and that is coming up. And their mainstream media, which is, again, culturally Marxist, bemoaning the fact that, oh my goodness, once you start to lose comedians, you lose democracy itself. And what they don't say is virtually all of the late night comics, the so-called comedians, they are all severely to the left. They're all big supporters of the Democrat Party, and they've never been supporters of the Republican Party. So almost all their jokes, 90% of the jokes, have to do with really severe slams on Republicans or conservatives. So it's no wonder that there's many young people, Gen Z and millennials, that are affected by that. As a matter of fact, more and more people get their news from the comedians than they do from people on the mainstream news anchors shows. But very interesting, they're bemoaning the fact that Colbert might be gone. There's even a picture. It shows 5 comedians, and this would be Stephen Colbert, Jimmy Kimmel, Jimmy Fallon, John Oliver, Seth Meyers. These guys are all severely, significantly to the left. So no sense. You don't have to, all you leftists out there, you don't have to worry. Lots of leftist, politically cranked to the left media still out there for you to draw on. Well, a very disturbing story, especially for those of us who kind of grew up with and followed popular shows in the past, like Friends, and of course the very tragic death of Matthew Perry that took place in 2023. And just recently in court, the person who was supplying him the ketamine, this particular drug that he overdosed on, her name is Jasween Sangha. And there were a couple of doctors that were charged, but the main person behind this who was cranking him up was Jasween Sangha, and a well-known celebrity by the name of Nicole Russo, if you may or may not know her, but she was, quote, a close friend of Matthew Perry. As this Jasmine got sentenced, and quite rightly, the drug dealer got 15 years in prison. And she also, in fact, she pleaded guilty to this. Very interesting, but sadly interesting fact that so many of these celebrities, the reason they can be funny, I guess, and crack jokes and feel loose all the time is because they're stoned on something a good part of the time. Very tragic report there. And Nicole Russo talking about this woman who was Jasmine, who was just loved by everybody and seen as, when she first came on the scene, as a young, sharp socialite, and mixing, of course, in many ways with the stars. And she talks about the dangers of drugs like ketamine. Don't rely on this stuff. We hear a lot about different types of antidepressants, but ketamine, I guess it gives you energy, plus helps you to be loose and funny, and eventually kills you. Well, we're seeing some, flipping back to what's happening with Iran. Turkey is more and more getting aggressive in their language, and we hope not in their military. But the Turkish president, his name is Recep Tayyip Erdogan. So you've probably heard of Erdogan. I remember back quite a number of years ago when he first got elected, everybody thought this is wonderful. The media always love calling Islamists moderates. They say there's some moderates and some that aren't moderates. Anybody who is severely and significantly Islamist is not moderate. They're very severe in terms of wanting only Islam to rule. Erdogan is no different. And watch for increasing activity there, especially as he moves in and wants to be more aggressive with Syria. Now, people would say, well, why did all these Islamists, these Muslim nations want to get into Syria? The country of Syria is at the north end of Israel, and the Golan Heights lead from Israel. They lead up to, it's elevated, obviously, up to Syria, the border, one of the borders of Syria. And for years from that Syrian border, and I've been there, I've been up on the Golan Heights and looked down, it was very easy for Islamists to just be up on the border there and shooting either rifles or firing mortars down at the farmers, the Jewish farmers down below in the Golan Heights. And that is why you're going to see Turkey continuing to want to put pressure to have more and more of an influence in Syria and pressing into the Golan Heights. Keep an eye on that. You heard it first here, Turkey and Erdogan making moves there. We already talked about what's happening relative to prices, and we've been talking about that. Walmart, which is usually just because it's such a giant organization, you can see buying trends and prices. You can look at Walmart because it's just so huge and so many people buy there, and they are saying the higher fuel costs, that's resulting in higher costs even at lower cost places like Walmart, and you're going to see that continue, unfortunately, for a while. It's something that you've been hearing in the last few days. You're going to hear that the bond market is slumping, and that gets confusing because we also hear that the stock market is surging, is going really well. And so politicians will say, look, it's not so bad. We've got price of oil's gone up, but look at the stock market. Remember, the stock market this last while, and that's companies people who analyze the stock market, they take an overall view of the entire market. Are stocks moving up or moving down? Because AI companies are so huge right now and millions of people investing, and AI is definitely going to continue to be profitable, AI companies. So that pulls the rest of the market up. So companies, smaller companies that might not be doing well, when you look at the average of how stocks are doing on average across the market, it does appear to be robust, and it is robust at a certain area. But when you hear the bond market is slumping, the bond market is really what some people call the thermostat for the whole economy. A bond is when a government needs to borrow money. And basically, they borrow from giant the banking industry or the investment houses. They borrow the money. So it's like you or like me going to someone and say, "Can you lend me $500?" And if you lend me the $500, a year from now, I'll give you your $500 back plus whatever the interest rate is. So let's say the interest rate is 5%. That means if it was 10%, at the end of the year, it'd be $50 plus your $500. Let's say it's 5%. So at the end of the year, I'm going to give you back your $500, and for you lending me the money, I'm going to give you $25. So when a government borrows a bond, it's a promise to pay back at a certain time at a certain rate. So if the government borrows, let's say at 2%, that's kind of a low, that's not a bad rate, not too high. But as more and more governments are borrowing more and more money, things get riskier. So the individuals or the banks or the bond market houses that are lending the money, they're going, it's getting risky out there. That government's getting more and more in debt, and I'm taking a bigger risk lending out my money. So then that bond market, that bond dealer comes back and says to the government, let's say of Canada, yeah, I'll give you your $500, but it's no longer at 2%, I want 5%. And so that's how debt continues to increase. It's called compounding. It gets higher and higher at a rapid rate. That's why don't get too relaxed. So you take a government like Canada, the Prime Minister will come out and announce, look how the stock market's doing. Things are fabulous. Government policies are working. The stock market's doing well. What they're not pointing at as much is the bond market is slumping. That means it's moving a little slower because the bond dealers are raising the interest rate. Raising the interest rate means they're nervous about the level of debt that governments are taking on. So keep a cautious eye there. Stock market's okay, but when bond markets are slumping, as they say, that means the cost of your money is getting higher. And underline what I say almost every show, if not every few days, what is the main reason for inflation? There's a number of causes, but the single greatest cause for inflation is, are you ready for it? Say it. Governments spending borrowed money. Governments spending borrowed money because they have to pay that money back at an ever increasingly high rate. That's the single greatest reason for inflation. Don't let your politicians get away with this. In the AI market, because we talked about the fact that so many people, mainly in North America, but other jurisdictions also, are not wanting to see these giant data centers built because they take so much energy. And I've been saying for some time, there's lots of alternate forms of energy. And a great story out of Asia today, the fact that, and we've talked about this too, Japan is really getting into nuclear fusion startups. Nuclear fusion is the way of the future. Nuclear fusion takes a very small amount, creates huge amount of energy with very small amount of byproduct being uranium. Again, media goes berserk. They go crazy. They say, oh no, now we're going to kill the world by nuclear. These are very small amounts of uranium that are used and can reduce significantly the carbon emissions around the world. Watch for Japan to keep moving ahead on the AR market and on the AI development. I can tell you what, if Japan is doing it, you can bet China's doing it. So all these politicians and these different groups running around saying, don't build the data centers, that's dooming us to falling behind technology. That means also falling behind in healthcare. It means falling behind in being able to defend ourselves from military attacks. Don't listen to politicians who are saying no AI. Look for those who are saying let's develop forms of energy that reduce the cost of building the data centers. Build the data centers, just not with the typical ways of energy. And if a data center is building in your municipality, then they should pay for the energy. You shouldn't be charging local consumers, but don't abandon AI. Well, I said at the start of the show, Starbucks got themselves in a little bit of trouble over there in South Korea. One of their marketing things, they developed a big marketing program called Tank Day, and Tank Day was going to be May 18th. It just so happens, now they said they did this by accident, but May 18th coincides with a pretty important day in the history in South Korea, because it was on May 18th in 1980. There was it was called the Gwangju Democratic Uprising. That's where citizens were uprising and protesting the increasingly harsh government of the day, and then the government crushed the protests, brought in the military, and it was called, bringing in the tanks. So the fact that Starbucks has got this program where you can get a great big mug of coffee, which is fine, but they call it a tank over there when it's translated. All kinds of trouble. So much reaction from people in the public saying, oh, you're celebrating the day the government's rolled in the tanks on us way back there on May 18th, 1980, that Starbucks has had to actually pull their program, and we're going to see if they recover or not in South Korea. You know, I was very upset with, there's been stories, and it seems to have circulated out of Afghanistan International. That's it's a news outlet in Afghanistan, English-speaking news outlet. Got picked up by other news outlets like the BBC. And the headline, let me read the headline to you. Afghan families selling children as poverty deepens. Afghan families selling their children as poverty deepens. No question at all. Poverty is getting worse and worse in Afghanistan. Why? It is a severely socialist state. It is run, of course, by the Taliban, and they do not believe in free markets. They don't believe in people. They are very culturally Marxist, believe it or not, in their economic policy. So they're starving in Afghanistan. But here's the thing that really bothers me. The story rolls out, and typical of BBC, which is like the CBC, very culturally Marxist, very left-leaning. It's almost like they're saying it's our fault. It's the Canadians' fault for being over there in Afghanistan in the first place. It's the Americans' fault for being over there, and then the Americans' fault for leaving. Afghanistan was a dirt poor, horrifically governed country when the Taliban took it over, before the Allies, including ourselves, went in there to try and push back the Taliban. While the Allies were there, and introducing things like schools for girls, universities for women, freedom of enterprise. Life was starting to pick up. And then after the disastrous exit, that rapid exit under Joe Biden, the bailing out of Afghanistan, it's gone back to the Islamist extremists who run it. You know, media love to say Taliban, and they are. It's like a denomination, a certain denomination of Islam. But it is Islam to the core. It is Muslim to the core, and it has caused the poverty. And what is wrong with it? It makes my blood boil when they do this. They did this sympathetic story. They interviewed a couple of fathers there, and the fathers were saying they were being translated. You know, things are so bad, and I've got 4 kids, so I had to sell one of them. I had to sell my 5-year-old daughter, and kind of reflecting back that it's kind of the fault of the West, never reflecting that it's on the extremely, I'm going to call it perverted policies of the Taliban, of these Islamists, and selling your daughter. Excuse me, folks, I will fight and die fighting. I will sell myself before I would sell my daughter. What is with a branch of religion that seems to think it's somehow not so bad to sell one of your children? And selling them into what? Selling them into sex slavery. That's where it goes. And then the other thing that the question I would have liked to see some of the reporter ask, who's buying them? Who's buying these 5-year-old girls? Part of the culture in Afghanistan, it's part of Muslim culture, is that the marriage of very, very young girls is something that's acceptable. Now, even as I'm saying this, for those of you who are leaning to the left, you're starting to go a little bit crazy. You're starting to say, oh, there you are picking on Islam. I'm just telling you what is happening over there in Afghanistan. But the reason the left reacts is they try and say that all religions are the same, all cultures are the same. No, some cultures are worse than others. The Nazi culture that Hitler brought into Germany for a number of years, that was a bad culture. It was not equal to Canadian culture, American, or even European culture. There was a bad culture. And some of the Islamic practices to even allow for someone to sell a child and then not going after the person who's buying that 5-year-old, and you know what they're buying them for, that's what's terrible. That's what's horrendous. That's what needs to be addressed and corrected. So our hearts go out to the people of Afghanistan. Prime Minister Carney is saying that the world is facing, it's like the Liberals woke up and said, the world is facing an energy crisis, and Canada can help to solve it. Folks, this is what people like myself were saying this 30 years ago, that by listening to the Greenpeace hyper-activists who are all cultural Marxists, all severe leftists, by listening to them saying that Canada is killing the world because of our oil and gas, we could have been saving the world. We could have been seeing the lowering of carbon emissions around the world by helping countries like China get off their coal, like helping countries like India get off of burning dung, and like helping countries of Europe not depend on Putin and buying his energy products, giving him money to kill Ukrainians. And this was all liberal. It's always been liberal policy in Canada to suppress our energy industry. And it looks like it's sad that as more and more of us point out, it looks like Prime Minister Carney may be seeing the light. I'm sorry that we're so far behind on them recognizing that, but let's see where that goes. Well, big debate that's raging following we talked about the day of rededication to God, where a number of politicians and, of course, people and speakers who were in Washington, and they had a peaceful, mark this, it was thousands and thousands of people there on Sunday, peaceful, nobody throwing bombs, nobody shrieking, nobody saying kill the Jews. It was very peaceful. But apparently Mike Johnson, who was the speaker, and I watched him do this, I caught the end of it, he came out and he gave a prayer and he reflected on the Constitution of the United States, which says that our rights, our basic human rights of freedom to speak, freedom to make these type of choices, freedom to worship, our God-given rights. And media even pushing back on that and saying, no, the Constitution doesn't say that. Their Constitution does say that. You don't have to agree with it, but it's right there in the second paragraph in their Constitution that rights come from God. A lot of politicians want to make people think that they're the ones that give you certain rights. You got to look to the politicians. Well, politicians take away rights. But the freedom of choice that we have, the human rights we have, those are God-given rights. And on MS Now, which used to be called MSNBC, we see their news anchor, some of you know her, Katie Tour. She was very upset that there would be any suggestion that these rights would come from God. Now, Katie's is controversial in this regard, and she's got a bit of a history of that. Actually, her dad, Katie Tour's dad, who's actually transgender identifying, so he was born male. His name was Bob Tour, but he switched it to Zoe. He said things like he famously said, and he never said an apology, but he said that he wanted to see, for instance, the host of the Daily Wire show, which is a very popular conservative show. He wanted to see Ben Shapiro going home in an ambulance. This is in 2015 because Ben Shapiro referred to him as Sir, called him Sir. So anyway, that's where that's the dad of the commentator. That's Katie Tour's dad. So a debate raging, very interesting to see. And it's principally among Democrats who are saying, nope, God does not give out rights. Politicians do, and that's the way it should be. And by the way, for Canadians who sort of roll their eyes at the Canadian Constitution, or at the U.S. Constitution, keep in mind, Canada's Constitution says in its preamble, quote, recognizing the supremacy of God, recognizing the supremacy of God. So before Canadians go too insane about the U.S. one mentioning God, we're in there pretty big too. Whether we accept it or not is another thing, but it is in there. Folks, have a great day. Thanks for tuning in.